Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session, The Great Debate. It's my absolute honor and pleasure to be your host for this session. So this is quite an interesting session where we're going to be discussing what's next. What happens next after 3 days now of talking about Africa's food systems and how we can transform. We're going to be discussing what exactly are the key priorities that need to be taken to move forward. I am joined by a fantastic panel who I'm excited to introduce to you. Before we get started though, I'd like to encourage those of you that are sitting at the back to come forward. Let's make it a nice and homely environment. And I also want to encourage you guys, I know it's the end of the day, but I want to encourage you to be engaged, to listen in, to be reactive. We like an animated panel, and this certainly will be one. So you're more than welcome to come through forward. And yeah, without further ado, let's get started. My name is Tanya Habimana, and I'm an anchor at CNBC Africa, and I cover the financial markets and the economy. And so this conversation is very, very important to me as we try to unlock just exactly how we can move forward as a continent to make sure that we seize the opportunity that is placed before us. So please join me in welcoming my panel. So first off, I would like to welcome to stage His Excellency Lionel Sinzou, board member at Danone and former Prime Minister of Benin. Let's give him a round of applause. I'd like to welcome to stage Ms. Eleni Gabri-Madhin, Chief Innovation Officer at UNEC. Joining us virtually, we have Dr. Sandy Thomas, Director for Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition. We have Dr. Achaleke, Senior Partner at McKinsey & Co. Mr. Khalid Bomba, Managing Director, Agri-Food Transformation Agency Support Center. And Mr. Ibrahim Sheikh Diong, UN ASG, and Director General for the Africa Risk Capacity Group.
Thank you.
So this format calls for not only discussing ideas, but discussing ideas that are implementable. Each of the panelists will have 2 minutes exactly to give their statement, their answer, their big idea. And then after that, the other panelists will be reacting, giving us their point of view, whether they agree or disagree. And later on, we'll also be taking maybe a few questions from the audience. So as we kick off this conversation, the question that we are going to be asking is, what is the biggest priority when it comes to transforming Africa's food systems? And I want to start by asking this to you, Mr. Diong.
Let me say a debate is always an interesting opportunity to have contradiction with the hope that we can come out with some concrete ideas. I will say 3 words: market, investment, and resilience. Market, because I hear everywhere in Africa, let's consume what we eat and let's actually produce what we eat. But the reality on the ground, Africa still continues to import so much to feed its need. So my hope, with the content of free trade and the size of the market that we have, we can begin to look at market differently before we actually look at the rest of the world and import. If there's any doubt, this is urgent. Look at the Ukraine crisis, look at the pandemic and how it disrupts the value chain system across Africa. It's about time we look within our continent to make sure we can have something sustainable as a market. Second, investment. There's so many Africans across the continent who are willing to invest in agricultural business. One of the most dire impediment is about access to finance, not short-term money, but long-term money. So it's about time our banks began to look at the sector, not necessarily something they just do every now and then, but something they do in a much more sustainable way so we can provide the concessional financing that we need, the cheaper money as we call it, the equity so we can actually invest in entrepreneurs for the long run. Last but not least, resilience. While we're actually talking about investing in the sector, there are so many Africans, particularly in the rural areas, who are affected by climate change, and their life and livelihood is actually affected. So therefore, what my organization does, the ability to actually transfer the risk to the insurance market, to mobilize additional resources so we can actually save the life of livelihood. So we can do three things at the same time.
Okay.
Access to market, capital, but also protect the life of many Africans. If you do that, we're going to transform the sector. I dare you. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much for that first big idea. Dr. Eleni, what are your thoughts on this? Do you agree?
Yes, in fact, some of what was said is music to my ears, particularly about investing in innovation, entrepreneurship, which is what I've been working on at UNDP, Regional Bureau for Africa. I believe that this is a historic opportunity and a historic convergence of three factors. One is people. The 1.2 billion population, of which 70% is youth. We talk about this all the time. But the other part of people is that 28% of this continent are entrepreneurs already. It is the most entrepreneurial continent in the world. Secondly is the factor of market. We have now with the AFCFTA a $3.2 trillion opportunity. How to unlock that obviously is the challenge. And the third is talent. Africa currently has the largest growing pool of developers. 22%, again beating the world average, is female. And we have currently Africa as the fastest growing region for venture capital financing. So how to bring all of this together? And we are in the process of launching or let's say promoting a $1 billion financing facility, which is both private and public capital, to basically solve the innovation ecosystem in Africa. So the big, bold idea is how to actually bring together all the pieces. We currently have 83% of foreign capital, capital going into venture capital that is foreign capital. There's no region in the world that has grown into a knowledge powerhouse, grown its innovation economy into a knowledge powerhouse with that much dependence on foreign capital. So we have to not only grow venture capital and early stage risk capital, let's say, but we have to source it also domestically so that we are aligned. The second part is that we have a very fragmented innovation ecosystem. Our universities are disconnected. Yeah. Where the knowledge is generated is not what is being commercialized downstream. So we need tech transfer programs and policies to put this into place. We also need to bridge with corporate R&D. So that's on the ecosystem side. And the third is unlocking.
Now, I have a question to the both of you, seeing as you're in agreement. You're talking about investing in agriculture, investing in innovation, investing in knowledge. But when we are on a continent where there are so many needs, how do we prioritize, and why should we prioritize investing in innovation, for example?
Well, the reality is we have to eat. We have to feed our people.
Do we have a choice?
So I can't think of a better priority than actually feeding our people and relying on something that actually they will eventually provide the sustainable way of actual food production in our country. It's a matter of priority and commitment from the political leadership. And then all the instruments we talk about, the access to market, the financing required to support entrepreneurs, and make sure actually agriculture is cool. It's not something you just do when you have nothing else to do. And there's so many Africans across the continent who are willing to get into this because it creates jobs, but also it contributes to the African GDP. So therefore, I can't think of a better priority than agriculture.
Okay, brilliant. We're going to move on to our second big idea. Mr. Khalid, what is your big idea?
So let me also use three words to frame my big idea, which is leadership, capacity, and partnerships. In this, I'd suggest that I think we all know that in order to have broad agricultural transformation, there are lots of different investments that are necessary and lots of different partners that have to be engaged in this process. public sector, private sector, civil society. However, it is the public sector that needs to provide that leadership. You can't do it without the public sector, just like you can't do it without the private sector. Both of them are critically important. And within the public sector, if we're thinking about food system transformation, you have to work across partners, across ministries, across civil society, public sector, and private sector. Unfortunately, most of our public sector is hollowed out. They just don't have the capacity to take on the challenge necessary to drive agricultural transformation. So what do? One of the things that we looked at in Ethiopia and was quite successful was creating a dedicated nodal agency or an agricultural transformation agency to manage and drive that transformation process in partnership with the Ministry of Agriculture and other partners. And it has some unique characteristics like being a time-bound organization, reporting to level of capacity, being independent, and working on a number of different things, such as, for example, the kinds of things you'd expect, like coordination and performance management. You'll see that in many places. However, it also has a couple unique characteristics which I think are critical for public sector to develop, and you don't see in many countries. One of which is an analytical capacity to do the kind of prioritization, to do this type of strategy development that we sometimes outsource to others, to do the policy analysis, again, that we outsource to others, but the public sector should be leading. I mean, my friend Aceh here, I think they do great work, but it's that kind of capacity. It's that kind of capacity you see at a McKinsey or a BCG or a Bain that we built in Ethiopia within the public sector so that we can actually do that kind of analysis internally. The second is direct project implementation. How do you actually translate the strategies, the pathways? I mean, there's tons and tons of strategies all over the agricultural sector. I think everybody by now knows what we need to do. The problem is actually, how do we get it done? Mm-hmm. And how do you build that capacity to translate ideas into realities on the ground? And government doesn't have to do everything, but it needs to provide the right incentives, the right enabling environment, and sometimes when nobody's able to do it, step in and do it as a public good. So for example, in Ethiopia, we did a digital soil map of the entire country in less than 4 years by collecting over 150,000 soil samples, analyzing all of it so that the Research Institute can provide targeted fertilizer recommendations to farmers. That by itself has the ability to save farmers millions of dollars, increase yields, and also protect the soil because now you're using the right nutrients. So building that kind of capacity within government allows you to provide greater leadership and step in when necessary, and when necessary, step back and let others do the work. So that's my suggestion of a big idea, is a targeted government organization that can help lead and drive the transformation process.
Okay, brilliant. Sir Lionel, what are your thoughts on this? Do you agree?
Good afternoon all. Broadly,
It's always a good start.
why? Because I consider that the best experts are the African small farmers, not the ministers. Because I consider that the metrics are quite important. Yes, investment is key. Providing equity is new. But what are the metrics? In Africa, credit to the economy represent average 40% of the GDP, which is 1/3 of what it is in European Union. 1/3. The only countries where credit to the economy are more than 80% of the GDP are Morocco, South Africa, Egypt. The rest is below 40%. It's the oxygen, financing is the oxygen, and not only for agriculture, but for the full chain. So what are the metrics? And that's why, even if sometimes I'm ridiculed as being Afro-optimist and have been ridiculed like that for the last 15 years. I'm not very optimistic on the metrics because we need to do what? Twice in terms of financial resources, in terms of debt going to the economy. And it's worst for equity, by the way. But let's speak of debt. What is necessary for a normal economy to be able to finance the working capital, the equipment, and so on? Twice. But twice what it is today, which means another 40% of the GDP. And unfortunately, another 40% is $1.2 trillion of additional resource per year. That's the volume. Morocco is the only country financed at 110% of GDP for the households and the corporates. Right. So every time, as a financier, I try and collect 100 million, somewhere 1 billion, like you do. I think, okay, we have already done the first billion of 1,200. The metrics are playing a bit against us. And it's very urgent to be able to collect those resources. Because on every wall here, you have 3 words. You have grow. The farmers have grown hugely our resources. In my country, in 1960, the moment of independence, we were 2 million. Today, we are 12 million. The supply of calories for the 12 millions are per individual twice what it was in 1960. Somebody, a lot of individuals, millions of people have delivered that. They have nourished the population. They have not been nourished themselves that much. Because the hunger is focused on the people producing the produce for the other people, which is a bit of a sort of most painful paradox in Africa. Who is hit by hunger? The people in charge of nourishing, and they have nourished the population. Then, where is the lie? It is the third word, reward. We have not rewarded. And now I think we have a question of justice. AGRA is providing tools for productivity, is accelerating transfer of knowledge. AGRA is indispensable. The commitment of leadership, as we have seen yesterday, is changing dramatically and is indispensable. Emblematic examples like what Ethiopia has done, double-digit 10 years by Haile Mariam's leadership and government, all that is very encouraging. But we have a question of changing the way we consider our fellow citizens, the small farmers. We have said a few times during those debates in those 3 days, we have to give to the farmers more than 6% of our budget. We have to give them more than 2% of our credit to the economy. Yes, we have to do that, because who is fueling our budget? I don't know if you have written a budget, each of you, and gone to an assembly. I had to do that because I have been very temporarily a minister, okay? The farmers' agriculture is fueling more than 50% of our public inflows, revenues.
And yet?
So when we say, we have to make an effort to give them a bit more than 6% of our budget, you see the injustice. Justice is to recognize that with a contribution average in sub-Saharan Africa of more than 1/4 of the GDP, with people fueling our budgets with half of the tax revenues, especially on their exports, which is another paradox of our economies, not to subsidize the exports, but to tax their exports. Now we have to have another regard, another view on that. The minimum, if we want to unlock the potential, is to re-establish a more normal balance in a context where the financing has to grow. And I'm quite optimistic, but the reward, there has been no reward, not at all. And that is, for me, a key question.
And I feel like that's already a big part of your big idea. And that kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, Ibrahima, the need for financing, the need for investing more into agriculture. But I'd like to go back to you, Khalid. What do you have to say to the fact that we're basically saying the metrics are wrong? We should be looking at this from a different perspective. How do you see this?
So I wouldn't disagree with that. And I would also suggest that what has been suggested regarding finance is not mutually exclusive with what I'm also proposing. I think they're very complementary. We absolutely do need different metrics as well as increased in investment, different types of investment, public investment, private investment, blended finance, lots of different types of investment. The question then becomes, where do you allocate those resources?
Yeah.
Of course, we want the private sector to play a huge role in allocating those resources when it comes from the private sector. But when it comes from the budgetary sources of the government, what are the trade-offs? Because there are always trade-offs. Who does that analysis? Who makes those decisions based on what data and evidence? Who generates that data? Where do you collect that data? And in many cases, you don't have the capacity within the public sector to do the thorough analysis to give the policymakers the evidence to make sound decisions. Of course, many of these decisions are political decisions, as they should be, but they should also be the data and evidence to inform those political decisions. And what I'm suggesting is that you need that kind of capacity within the government itself so that it can be deployed to make smart, good decisions on the allocation of resources. I'm not suggesting that you don't need more resources. I'm absolutely on board with the fact that agriculture is underfinanced, especially at the smallholder farmer level, but also across the entire supply chain, primarily at the aggregator level and small and medium-sized enterprises that link farmers to markets. We always talk about farmers and increasing production and productivity. We talk about markets and value addition, but how do you connect the two? And the finance is missing. So what I'm suggesting is really the how in the allocation of resources, how in the decision-making process and building that capacity within government.
Brilliant. I'm now going to bring you in, Dr. Sandy, and ask you the same question. What is the biggest priority when it comes to transforming and advancing Africa's food systems? Your big idea in 2-3 minutes.
She's on mute.
I believe you are muted, Dr. Sandy. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
We can indeed.
Good. Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and greetings from London. So I'll certainly answer your question, and I've also been asked to make a few remarks on food system resilience in a changing world. So I think I'd very much like to bring those points in about multiple sources of resilience. And I certainly agree with the remarks we've just been hearing about the need for better data for investment decisions and more investment. I think that's very clear. I'd like to say that I'd like to talk really about the importance of policymakers coming to terms with making food systems more resilient as a matter of course and dealing with multiple forms of challenges at the same time, multiple crises. So I think 1 year on from the Food System Summit, the world looks very different. We've had the crisis from Ukraine going on since February. And we've seen clearly what those disruptions are looking like, disruptions to the global food supply, spiraling inflation, huge prospective increases in energy and fertilizer prices. But I think the resilience of food systems, and hence how we approach transformation of food systems in sub-Saharan Africa, or the whole of Africa, it shouldn't be measured by their ability to cope with a single event or 2 or 3 events occurring at the same time. We only have to consider what's been happening in the Horn of Africa. So here, of course, the Ukraine crisis is having an impact. There's been ongoing problems with regard to food supply chains and COVID, but there's also been a drought of historic proportions, and also a really bad plague of locusts. So we've got here parts of Africa where there isn't just one major impact or one crisis. What we're having here is that we've got multiple crises. So I think that's very important, in that policymakers in Africa seeking to transform food systems will need to think about multiple crises occurring at the same time. And I think many of us have a tendency to think rather more about the crisis that we're immediately enveloped in. The other point I would really make in policymakers needing to think carefully about transforming food systems is to recognize that the world is changing under our feet. We know about the effects of climate change. We know that they're set to worsen in the coming years, no matter what changes we make to greenhouse gas emissions in the immediate future. We also see signs that the geopolitical landscape is changing, and that we may be entering what we might call a period of readjustment as major powers like Russia and China seek to reshape their spheres of influence. So these kind of shifting geopolitics will have potentially profound implications for food systems. And we can already see that deglobalization is happening in some sectors. So my second point here is really that policymakers need to, seeking to achieve food system transformation over the coming decades, need to think about a world in transition, but also the world of tomorrow. And that means having a credible vision of the future, at least 10 or 20 years ahead. And then the final point here in thinking about a much more energetic approach to managing multiple crises at the same time and building in resilience, I think, is that we need to place it in this wider and longer term context. And I think, we know that healthy, sustainable diets are currently inaccessible to over 3 billion people, but we need to have diets that are both sustainable and healthy. And this does mean at the same time as securing those healthy diets. And I think there's a great deal of evidence now about what works in some settings. What we need to think about here is how can we make greenhouse gas emissions compatible with 1.5 degrees of global warming, because we can see that climate change is coming perhaps more severely and faster than we might have thought in some parts of the world. So at the same time, we have to think about biodiversity loss, water use, and so on. So thinking about both today and tomorrow, and both healthy diets and the sustainability, I think is absolutely vital. So yes, we need to redouble our efforts to make food systems in Africa resilient, but not at the expense of delivering the longer term goal of sustainable, healthy diets for all. And then the other thing I think that's just very important here for the future here in general is thinking that it's not just about focusing on making people resilient to food shortages and poor nutrition, for example. It's also important to focus on the processes by which you do this. And I think focusing on key institutions and intervention mechanisms, particularly those that are needed to protect people's consumption patterns and purchasing power. So I think what I'm really trying to say here is that people's resilience depends very much on the resilience of processes. So it's these processes that we need to keep in mind very much as we try and transform food systems. And we were asked in preparing for this if we had one big idea, and I guess this is a long way around of me coming to that. I think if I were to propose one idea that I think is important, it's really putting a drive on diversification, not just of food production, but also building diversification of demand. And I think there are really good reasons for doing that, that if we have diversity of food production, then we're going to promote resilience to a range of events that might affect particular crops or countries, and it will reduce the risk of pests and diseases in monocrops. And it's also aligned with providing access to healthy diet. But just to finish, I think it's vital that we diversify demand, and we produce not just more healthy, nutritious food, but we produce sufficiently more of it to drive prices down and make them affordable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sandy. Now, quite an interesting point that you just mentioned there, in the fact that you're talking about diversification of demand, of production, and at the same time you mentioned preparing for the future, long-term resilience and climate change. So I'm actually going to turn my attention to you, Ibrahima, because you deal with African risk capacity, you deal with climate change, the environment, the soil. How do we marry increasing local production, increasing capacity versus taking care of the planet, reducing emissions?
Well, the reality is, when you look at climate change, as the doctor has said earlier, when it comes to Africa in terms of its impact, the negative impact on vulnerable community, it's a reality. It's not a myth in the sense, if you look at the impact of drought and food insecurity across Africa, is tangible. If you look at the impact of tropical cyclone in Madagascar, Mozambique, is there. If you look at flood, if there's any doubt what happened in Niger, we saw the impact. So the question is, what can we do as a continent, to the leadership you talked about earlier, to basically help African countries to have more visibility on their exposure to the impact of climate change so that something can be done about it. Mm-hmm. And at the African risk capacity, I believe is really three words: plan, prepare, and response. And the planning basically involves making sure if drought doesn't just happen. In fact, if you have a good forecasting system, you know you're gonna have a rain deficit a year from now. And I think, as my brother here said, having access to reliable data will help policymakers to make informed decisions whether to retain the risk or to transfer the risk to the insurance market. And I think the planning side is that within government, there's so many entities that are actually involved in providing the response. Oftentimes, and I'm speaking under the control of the former Prime Minister here, where lack of coordination lead to government being slow in responding, and we're losing life and livelihood. And I think as my last point, is the response involve different innovative financing instruments. Insurance is one of them. Through a premium system, you can basically mobilize resources off budget that allows government its first response to come from resources that come from the insurance market. Now, I am not implying that's the only solution. There's social safety net, the contingency fund, the solidarity fund, there are other funding instruments. But the idea is to say governing is anticipating. And if you wait till it happens, it may be too late and you may lose life. We can invest, but at the same time, let's also make sure we protect the vulnerable communities.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. We've got an extra guest joining us right now, virtually, Ms. Franny Leotier, Senior Partner at Southbridge Group and CEO of Southbridge Investments. So I'd like to welcome her to this debate. Now, still on the debate, so we've heard quite a few ideas. Ibrahima talked about market, investment, building resilience. Khalid was talking about developing hubs, regional hubs, capacity. Dr. Eleni, we still need to hear from you, and I would like you to actually share your big idea.
Am I on? Okay, thank you, Tanya. My big idea really is that innovation will solve the problems that we're talking about. Data is something that is no longer the realm of public sector. We are talking about private initiatives that are actually changing how we live. In agri-tech, which is now the fastest growing, one of the fastest growing tech sectors, and is being in fact labeled or billed as the new fintech, there are enormous amounts of innovation. Soil mapping doesn't need to be done by public agencies. It can be done embedded in smart agriculture solutions that are actually rolled out as private initiatives by startups. So I think the big idea is, how do we unlock early stage risk capital and bring together the pieces of the innovation ecosystem, the knowledge centers, the R&D, to bear on generating innovation solutions to the problems that we face.
Okay, any reactions to this? Dr. Acha, I see you with your notes.
Oh, no, yeah, I'm trying to learn from these big ideas. I mean, I think it's hard to disagree with any of these ideas, right? I think, whether it's, like you said, whether it's capital, do we need more capital into the sector? Absolutely. Do we need to create bigger markets to make the overall sector more economically sustainable? You can't say no to that. Do we need more innovation, to Eleni's point? Absolutely. Do we need it to be more resilient? Do we need more diversification? Do we need more lending into the sector? But with all due respect, I actually think we're asking the wrong question, right? I think as Africans, we are very good at coming up with these ideas, right? And my fear is we come up with another set of big ideas. I think the challenge is less the what, but it's more the how. And that's why I was very happy when Khalid started to talk about the how. I think that for me is what we should focus a lot more on, right? We are in a space where we know we continue to depend too much on imports of products. We still import, 50% of our rice. And like I said earlier, we love eating our rice. We import 70% of our wheat. We import 60% of our medicines. We import 99% of our vaccines. Nobody will argue with the fact that we need to produce more locally. And I'd love us to spend a bit more time on the panel today talking about what's it going to take to make this happen, such that, and how we're going to track, I think to Lionel's point, how we track and measure such that, next year when we come, we'll say this is where we were and this is the progress we've made, and we can track that over time. So that's my contribution.
Okay, I like that. Challenge accepted. Let's talk about the how. Franny, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us. So we've been talking about big ideas. We've been talking about the priority when it comes to advancing and transforming our food systems on the continent. If you had to state in a couple of minutes, I told everybody 2-3 minutes, although that's been stretched a little bit, what would be your big priority?
Thank you very much, and apologies for joining late. I had internet issues. My big idea is at the interface of three important aspects, and I hear from the report out that some of them have been covered by the other panelists. And it's really the interface between technology, innovative finance, and trade. Technology to observe from satellites what's happening on the ground in terms of changes in weather patterns, crop production levels, and so on, which would help the continent predict what's going to happen to food production. And I think that is going to help us plan ahead. Then on trade, because when you see then the patterns of production across countries, and we now have this continental free trade area, we can organize to have a global arrangement for the continents to trade food amongst countries, because it's always the case that there's a heavy yield or production in one country and a very difficult one in a neighboring country. So if we could organize using this data that we've collected on the spatial side for the trade side to also come along, and that would also help us predict what kind of insurance mechanisms, safety nets we need, because we can predict forward. And then finally, innovative finance, because that is going to help us to bridge the gap between what we can do today with the existing arrangements and what we can do in the future. And I'm very, very excited to hear the focus about how we go about this, because I think we have all the pieces in place, but we haven't really put them together in a way that allows us to really tackle the triple problem of uncertainty in the production and yields, and therefore the implications they have for famine and food shortages, but also for nutrition. Second, the current challenges versus the future challenges, and how we incorporate climate variations and plan ahead so that we can develop warehousing solutions, cross-country trade, and substitution products in between, including, for example, the protein side, where we could quite easily think through different types of protein that can be grown very quickly to deal with risks that would have an impact, for example, on the pastoralists and other animal-related risks. And then, of course, on the finance side, we have already arrangements to support public solutions to challenges in the agricultural sector. But when you look on the private sector side, there are very few opportunities for risk mitigation, which we could do a lot to improve. Very few opportunities to actually partner with the public sector in order to deliver in the short term when we face short-term risks. And then we don't have sufficient innovation to finance innovation. So I think this is a big area where we could work together to get that settled. So those are the triple leg stool for our continent: innovation around technology and how we use it, the innovative finance solutions, and then finally how we get these trade relations to work to solve short-term and then medium-term problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Franny. I'm going to open up to my panelists, but I think, Lionel, you have a commentary already?
Yeah, I think there is a broad consensus on many issues. Investment, importance of resilience, a different processing of development, more innovation, the three interfaces of Franny. I think that is quite clear. And what is reassuring is that AGRA is doing a large part of this job, of, especially on seeds, especially on fertilizers and so on, but more broadly nowadays, in terms of the food systems as an integrated chain with holistic policies and the proper advisory service to the governments. But we have maybe a little discrepancy on the how, on ACHA saying essentially everything is very clear, but we are unable to implement. Because when I entered in this room, I thought that I was a sort of social democrat politician, second-tier politician. And I discovered that I'm a fierce capitalist and a right-wing politician. Because when I hear you, I think we have to empower the farmers more than the institutions. The processes are interesting if we give them back to the real operators. I've rarely seen something more impressive than what Mr. Adesina has done in Nigeria. And it's not a hazard that he has been a founder of AGRA, by the way. When he was Federal Minister for Agriculture, by decentralizing the subsidies, giving to the farmers voucher for the subsidy, in order not to have anything centralized, because we have seen in so many of our countries, state-owned companies, bodies, absolutely unable to implement the transformation with a dream of capacity building when the capacities are on the ground by the real people, not by the people in charge of supporting them. And what it has delivered in Nigeria, I was really very, very impressed because it has been a very, very quick win in terms of unlocking more output and using innovative finance in a sense, because it was digital money as well. But the freedom for the farmer to go and select the proper fertilizers with a bit of competition for the suppliers was so much more efficient than a centralized public market procurement situation. I think that's why I will leave this room not being socialist anymore. We need to empower the real operators because we have a human capital there, which is absolutely expert. And I advise to everybody here, including in the panel, Acha, be candidate to a presidential election. You will speak with millions of people, and you will come back with an immense respect for them, immense, because you have not given them credit, innovative finance, proper trade policies. You have not given them water. You have not given them education. You have not, and they are so good, and they have grown the crops and nourished all the other ones but themselves. So the expertise, the human capital is huge. The more we can prove by examples, pilot successes. Yesterday we were speaking with Agnes, with the president of Niger. Niger is exporting seed, and it has been an initiative
Exactly, and there's quite a few of these.
of AGRA a few years ago.
Just to move on with the debate, I'd like to ask you, Acha, you've challenged us in the how. The question is not correct. It's not what, but it's how. So what is the how?
Well, I'll share one of mine, and I'd love to, again, reactions here. And it starts from this idea of reducing on import dependency. We just rely on too many of our products, on importing too many of our products, right? And I remember Aliko Dangote always reminds us that, when we import a product, we're exporting jobs, and we know that by far jobs is the biggest issue we have on the continent. Right? And so if we take, a sort of book from what we did on the vaccine manufacturing front, we said, look, 25% of all vaccines in the world are administered in Africa. With the COVID crisis, we realized we couldn't have access to all these vaccines that we needed. Less than 1% are manufactured in Africa, right? And I feel like we also have a food crisis now. So why don't we take advantage of this crisis and say, look, let's pick 5. You take your number. I don't think it should be 20, right? I think it should be 5 commodities where we say we want to significantly reduce the amount we import, right? Rice is at 50%, wheat is at 70%. We have Eleni and others experts here who can tell us which of these 5 they should be. But let's pick 5. Let's then figure out what is the actual plan to reduce these imports, right? And it starts by setting a target, right? By 2030, where do you want to be? About 50% on rice, do you want to be at 20, 10%, whatever the number is. But of course, fact-based, where do you want to be? And that's the first step. So in vaccines, we said we want to go from 1% to 60%. And then we align the entire continent on this. So it's more of a continental aspiration behind these. Then the second is the how. How do you get there, right? And again, I think to Lionel's point, it's all integrated. The demand, you need to have the demand for these products. Where is it going to come from? You need to have the financing for it, like we talked about. You need to have the research. You need to have the training. So all of these elements need to come together in a package. The big question we face on the vaccine front is, where do you do it? Again, because you need bigger markets. So we chose 5 hubs. 5 countries. Next thing we know, 17 countries woke up and said, why them? Why not me? How did you choose this person? Why, And the reality is, if you see the announcements today, if all of these plants are built, it's 3 to 4 times more than what we need as a capacity on the continent. And as a result, economically, it's not going to be sustainable. So how do we then get more regional collaboration to agree on this country is going to do it for the region and why this versus what are you going to do for the region? But we need a lot more regional and continental collaboration to align on this plan. And then the third thing for me then is, let's monitor. Like I said, we have a plan, we know what we need to do. Let's track, let's monitor, let's come to every AGRF summit and say, here's where we are, here's the progress we've made, what next? So that's my idea.
What do you see as a potential bottleneck to this being implemented?
Well, I think, the biggest bottleneck is the regional and continental collaboration. That's by far the biggest issue. We're going to say, wheat or rice, or say, why X country should do it for us, or why not this country. And that's why I think there's a bigger role. We talk at the AU level, there's a much bigger role that our regional economic communities can play, right? So I do a lot of work with governments around the continent, but we never do sort of regional strategies. What's our regional strategy across ECOWAS? What's our regional strategy across EAC, across SADC for whatever commodity? And how do we then align countries and say, remember, when President Kagame was setting up the process to set up BioNTech, he told me, he said, okay, we will do BioNTech here for the region. Let's figure out what inputs we're going to get from Kenya, what inputs we're going to get from Uganda, right? Because that doesn't make sense for all of us to try to replicate this, right? Let's produce it here. Let's go do and fill and finish in Ghana. So how do we work better together to accomplish this? And I think that's really the bottleneck.
Khalid, what are your thoughts on this?
Broadly, I very much agree with that, right? And maybe it's my nature to think about how do we link all of these together, because I don't think there's anything that anybody has said that any of us would disagree with. I think everything that has been said, we all would broadly agree, yes, we need to do that. So for me, there's a sense of, first, we can't do everything, right? There's only so much resources, there's only so much capacity, there's only so much time, and there is a need to prioritize. Because you've got to figure out what are the levers that you can pull that will give you the maximum impact, that will create momentum for change. Mm-hmm. And that's where kind of that analytical piece, I think, becomes really important, and that decision-making based on data. I'd also very much agree with Lionel's point that ultimately it is those farmers on the ground that we have to empower. But at the same time, looking at the example of Nigeria and what Akin had been able to do, that didn't happen magically, right? There was actually a product, a tool that was developed to empower those farmers.
Yeah.
And some analysis that went into what is going to provide those farmers with the resources in the most efficient way, and that decision was made and worked out beautifully. But there's a process to get there. And while I agree with Acha's view that we have to plan, we have to know what we have to do, and we have to monitor it, I think there's that step in between of actually executing. Who's going to execute? Do they have that capacity? Are they the right partner to execute?
Yeah.
Do they have the resource to execute? Do they have the enabling environment to execute? Do they have the right delivery, right? In terms of, for example, the digital voucher that was used. I suspect that there was paper vouchers and other ideas as well. So we've got to make sure that we choose those implementing partners properly and give them the tools, resources, enabling environment to execute. And some of it is blended finance, some of it is technology. So I think all of these different pieces actually fit together. It's just a matter of getting the right, all the stakeholders, the necessary stakeholders in the room to prioritize, figure it out, and then kind of setting them on their way and performance managing everybody. And most importantly, and this is kind of something that we discovered in Ethiopia, and Napoleon said it, and Mike Tyson said it. A plan is only as good as when you face your first enemy or you get punched in the mouth. And then all of a sudden you have to recalculate. Right? There is no plan that we implemented in Ethiopia that at the end looked exactly the same as it was at the beginning. Because once you start executing, then you learn. And it's only when you learn and adapt your plan that you actually are able to deliver in the most efficient way possible. And you need the ability to do that analysis, to change course if necessary, to shift, to move, and that agility. So how do you do that? And it's not one organization that does it. It's actually the stakeholders together, because we've always talked about a systems approach. That systems approach requires mutual accountability and mutual joint management of all of what's happening in the process. So again, I agree, as I think we all do, of the things that are being outlined here, centrally of empowering those smallholder farmers, using technology and other delivery mechanisms to do it. And I think the how is the most important thing, and it varies from place to place, varies from time, at different time frames.
Yeah.
But it's just managing that process.
So with that, Ibrahima,
Well, Tanya, I've learned for a very long time, I agree with everything that Acha says, because Acha knows better, as they say. But I think what hasn't been talked about in this conversation, talk about the how, I wonder to what extent actually we have learned as Africans from the disruption of the supply chain system and how it affected our continent. When the pandemic was at its peak, any African that I've spoken to, they complained the fact that the West were very much focusing in meeting their demand. They could care less about the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And then when the Ukraine crisis came up, we went to Russia and brokered a deal. And I wonder whether we learned from that to say, well, how do we actually fix this in a way that we can fix our logistic, our supply chain, whereby when we create the market through the content-free trade, we have what it takes to actually get products around in the way that we can actually create a business. I'm not sure we have done that. And so we're being very transactional in fixing the short-term problems. And I like to challenge Acha, who knows better than me on this, to figure out what can we do as a continent to make sure our supply chain systems are actually fixed in a way that we can actually support agriculture and other sectors. It's like energy. If you produce so much energy, but you can't get it to where it's needed, it serves nothing. It's the same thing about agriculture. So maybe the task here to AGRA, well, look at our supply chain system. What do we learn from the pandemic, from the Ukraine crisis, whereby we begin to build the capacities, the logistic, the system whereby within the continent we can get product around. And until we do that, We may have the market, but we can't seize the opportunity, in my view, is part of how.
And I want to add to that, and I actually want to ask Atcha, who knows better. Not just learning from the shocks that we've experienced in order to build systems, but also learning to build resilience for future economic shocks. Because what's to say that we don't have another crisis in a year or 2 or 10 years? So how can we take the situation we're in today to build a better future from all points of view?
I mean, I'm happy to, add some perspectives and hear from others who know better than me as well. I think, to Ibrahima's point, this is the time to do it. Because in the crisis, I was thinking, we talk about let's not waste a good crisis. And I feel in COVID, we all spoke about the fact that we needed to manufacture more. Then COVID happened. And then because of the crisis, people said, okay, even though the pharma companies may not have been excited about manufacturing pharmaceuticals or vaccines in Africa, there was pressure on them to do so, right? The governments came together and said, we need to do that. We need to have the logistics. We need to have the financing. And everybody came together and said, what do we do about it? And I feel like, my whole thing was, we didn't waste the COVID crisis. Let's not waste the food crisis, right? Let's figure out now, because of the crisis, people are attentive. They're trying to figure out, some people just want to help the continent. Great. Let's bring them on board. And let's figure out how we can do that, how we can fix the supply chains, what needs to happen. Because to your point, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. There will be another crisis. And so my point is, I think this is actually the moment to really think about that, to put a plan together, and then to align all the different stakeholders, folks who may not have been interested in the past, to help us for whatever reason. Now is the time to align them, either because they feel guilty or because they feel, it's just the right thing to do, and let's get going on it.
Brilliant. Dr. Eleni, I actually have a question for you as well. How do you see innovation and basically the precepts of your big idea fitting into preparing us for the future?
Yes, well, I want to say, I was just thinking as folks were speaking that, 15 companies in the US that didn't exist 20 years ago contribute $9 trillion to the US economy. Just let that sink in for a second. Yeah. 15 companies. In Africa, we now have 8 or 9, numbers keep changing, but unicorns, billion-plus-dollar companies, that have achieved more for financial inclusion, engaging millions of SMEs, millions of households using financial payment systems that are actually far outpassing the amount of development finance that has gone into financial inclusion programs and plans XYZ. So I think that an intention, and let me even give another example. A tiny country of 8 million people, Israel, has twice the number of listed companies on NASDAQ than all of Europe combined. So how did they do that? When a single Israeli company in 2019 Mobilize has a technology started by a couple of young people, has a technology that is now embedded in every unmanned autonomous vehicle, UAV, and that sold for $15 billion and shifted the GDP in 2018 of Israel out by a few points. So how did Israel intentionally create an ecosystem to enable that to happen? How did the factors that made Silicon Valley come together? How is Austin and Boston and New York now trying to catch up? If we don't catch up, we're going to be bypassed. Because I really feel it's not about, just thinking about plans and programs, but really about the ecosystem that we need to create. Because what we have, like the many, many farmers, is millions and millions of young people with ideas, with the energy, the capacity, the talent, the education, and the aspiration to actually move the needle in every one of these areas: health, agri, cities, logistics, trade, all of the problems, supply chain. All of these are problems that can be solved by people with ideas. But what we don't have is the connection. And I love what Franny said, which is, how can we innovate to finance innovation? That's actually, for me, the biggest how that we need to unlock. And I think if we could, put our thoughts on that, we would go
And I want to get to that actually, the topic of investments. But before we get to that, Sir Lionel, you have a comment?
No, I'm impressed by our three lady colleagues on the panel, being, and it's normal in Africa, very much focused on innovation and the fact that we have the toolkits nowadays. And again, AGRA has been one of the builders of those toolkits of innovation. And we have more innovation. And I fully agree that fintechs or telecom operators with digital money, in a sense, have been more efficient for inclusiveness and because of that, for farming than many policies focusing on that. So I fully follow our colleagues. But I want to say to Acha, you are the dream of a prime minister, because you have an integrated, so smart way. And I'm absolutely, as a board member of AGRA, delighted to see your very, very smart and congenial team here with us. But again, the metrics. Our farmers, they deliver $750 billion of value added every year. Our ministers of finance and other prime ministers manage sort of 20% of the GDP of Africa, 600 billion. The budget of the agriculture minister is average sort of 5% of that, 30 billion. We have to optimize the way we use those 30 billion. It's obvious. And I'm 100% of the view, as you say, that regional governance is making progress and has to be accelerated. I thought that during the pandemics, what the African Union did in terms of platform for trade, supply of equipment, vaccines, logistic payments, it has been an immense progress. So I totally accept the paradigm, but this paradigm remains the way to optimize the 30 billion, which are really the levers of the ministers. But the other guys, the other 600 million people, delivering the growth and the nourishing of the planet, how do we access to them? It's not just to tell them, we will coordinate Benin with Burkina Faso, Niger, and Ghana, and we will share a good plan for rice. I mean, we really, really have to think the other way around, bottom up. And I think it's very important not to go top down too much. Because again, they deliver 750 billion. We have to start from there. And they do that with a sort of rate of growth of 8% per year. So it doesn't mean that they are not in a growing mode and efficient at that. But I think that it's very important to be very humble and consider that, yes, we have to optimize the bureaucrat's life, the minister's life, but the real question is, how do you give that in their hands in terms of you have an access to seed, you have an access to cheaper financing, but microfinance, you have blockchain, smart contracts in order to secure your value chain and your relationship with off-takers. But the question is not to have a national plan of blockchain. It's just to experiment on the field and scale up. So I'm 100% with you, except that we have probably to be very much bottom up with as much as we can and as quickly as we can, demonstrating on the field by pilots and scaling up to larger
I really like what you're saying. It's quite an interesting perspective because we've talked about increasing investment. We've talked about ensuring that we have more financing into agriculture. But ultimately, what you're saying here is how can we optimize what's already on the table? And I think I'd actually like to ask the question to you, Acha, and to you, Dr. Eleni. How can we optimize the current financing and investment that has been put into agriculture? Who wants to go first?
I mean, I can start maybe by responding to Lina. I completely agree with him. At the end of the day, all of this, the production is going to happen through the smallholder farmers. So that's where it's going to take place. So yeah, we can talk about plans and all of that, but that's how it's going to get executed. And I really like his idea of pilots because, I think part of sometimes our issues when you try to drive execution, you try to do this big thing and it never takes off versus saying, let's do a few pilots, let's see how it works, let's learn from it, and let's figure out how we scale it. So I fully agree with that, and I think that's the sort of top-down and bottom-up approach that we should use. I mean, on the financing, I think there are better experts here on financing, but we know that the numbers we saw for SMEs, it was 3 to 4% of all lending goes to SMEs today. I remember when we did the work with Lamido Sanusi when he was still governor of the central bank, when we set up, with Akin actually, when Akin was at Rockefeller, and we set up NERSO, right? At the time in Nigeria, it was 1.6%. Of lending that went into the sector, and what we found was, as much the banks, it was a two-way street. It was the banks that were not ready to lend, right, and they were lending to other sectors that were probably easier to lend to because they did not understand the sector. But also, it was the farmers who didn't know how to approach the banks, right? They didn't know how to put a business plan together. They didn't know how to, close the books. They didn't know how to engage with the institutions, and so a lot of the work that was done was to say, okay, yes, let's put some pressure on the banks, let's put some incentives as well to encourage them to lend into the space. But let's also figure out how we upskill the farmers and upskill some of the cooperatives they work with to help them prepare themselves to actually receive this money, right? So I think you have to work on both sides as well.
And Dr. Eleni, is this perhaps something where innovation comes into place?
Well, I'm really excited by some of the, going beyond de-risking, which obviously we can talk about at length, but, and there are good de-risking models and not so good de-risking models for agricultural innovation financing in itself. But I also think that there are some alternative finance mechanisms, and I've seen a few that are promising, although not yet really, at scale. And one is, using blockchain itself as a way to inject capital into agriculture, and I've seen a few efforts with that. And the other is crowd. We all want to somehow, connect. I mean, it's not a coincidence that a company like Kiva.org, if you've seen peer-to-peer lending, has mobilized over $1 billion in increments of $50. We have an enormous diaspora, and actually that's one word I didn't hear very much here over the last 3 years. But how can we tap into diaspora financing as an alternative financing into innovation for the continent, into agricultural innovation financing? I think that there are some interesting models that people are experimenting with, bridging, and maybe, I don't know if McKinsey's been looking at this, but I think that is one of the next frontiers, actually, is alternative financing that involves peer-to-peer, decentralized blockchain types of events, crypto itself. So I think, so I'm looking at those innovations in financing for innovation.
Innovating for finances, as Fanny said. So quite a few interesting ideas have been laid out here. What we're now going to do is take maybe one question from the audience, and each one of you can answer that question in relation to your big idea. So if we have any questions. I have a question from the gentleman here. And if I can ask to please try and keep your question as simple as possible.
So my question is, we've heard a lot of words, innovation, technology, capital, I name it, but investment. And I miss one, infrastructure. And if you look at the review of the Green Revolution in Asia, the infrastructure was among the enabler, the biggest enabler. And if you look back to the IFPRI report on rural revitalization, if we talk back again to the justice, taking the capital, investing in the rural area, I think what they need there is also infrastructure. So what do you think about infrastructure in the how? Thank you.
Okay. We'll start on this side. Ibrahim, you can go first.
Well, look, the reason why we didn't spend too much time on infrastructure, we thought it was a given that unless you improve the cost of doing business, any sector in the African continent actually will strive. So therefore, there's no point in producing something in the rural areas if you don't have the roads to get it to actually where the market is. There's no point of transforming agriculture if you don't have reliable energy so you can actually produce and transform on the spot. And there is no point of actually not having, a sound telecommunication system if you actually want to innovate. So I think the general principle is that for any African countries, the cost of doing business is make sure you have actually a sound, sustainable infrastructure system so it actually supports agriculture. So I see it more as a cross-cutting component as opposed to just entirely for agriculture.
Yeah.
But I agree 100% that we need to actually reduce the cost of doing business. Okay. And that's my view when it comes to infrastructure.
Brilliant. Khalid, from your perspective?
I would very much agree, and just add that, in addition, as we think of infrastructure, there's the physical infrastructure that, of course, has to be in place. There's the digital infrastructure that, as my brother highlighted, is the platform upon which most innovations need to be based in order to get to scale. For example, extension no longer needs to depend solely on extension agents walking from farmer to farmer. There are much more efficient ways of doing it. And as Elaine pointed out, the way in which we did the digital soil mapping was a highly labor-intensive approach that's not necessary anymore. So the digital infrastructure is critically important in addition to that physical infrastructure.
Okay. I think that with the two of you, we already have quite a well-rounded answer. Lionel, would you like to add something?
Yes, to concur by saying that there is a financial revolution, another one, apart from the innovative financing, which is that we have now infrastructure private funds with patient capital, and you find on the market 12 to 15 years fund, private, with very decent returns, involved in Africa, and after a few years of transport infrastructure, mobility-related, railways, harbor, and so on and so forth, they now consider two new domains. One, agriculture, because yes, you need energy for agriculture, water, supply, cold chain, so on, and irrigation. It's absolutely key. And the second domain is social infrastructure in terms of education and healthcare. So they are reorientating, but it's a new bucket of long-term resources. And the second revolution, or third revolution, is the fact that we also have carbon finance, which can finance agro combined to forestry. There is a huge demand because of the carbon certificate demand and needs in the advanced economies. And that could be another new significant bucket of long-term resources and could be also combined to those infrastructure privately financed.
Brilliant. So as we close, I would like to welcome back Dr. Sandy for closing remarks as well as Franny.
Thank you very much. I think this has been a fascinating conversation, and I think we've heard a great deal about the diversity of ideas that's needed, particularly on what I would call the left-hand side of the food system, which is really around, particularly around production. I still think there are great opportunities to work with consumers so that they create a more nuanced, informed demand for healthy diets that are sustainable. I think to some extent that is where there is some real work to do. I mean, I think we've heard some very sensible ideas about finance, about data, about empowering farmers. which I think all of these, I think we would love to get more attention from policymakers, and more investment is obviously definitely going to be needed. But we are talking about a system, and that means we need to look at efficiencies across the whole system in all the quadrants that are often recognized within the food system: availability, affordability, desirability, and so on. And that does mean bringing in the consumer, because I think the consumer has the power to demand more of a nation's agriculture or a region's agriculture. So I think there are real opportunities at AGRF to build in that side more. But I mean, terrific ideas, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sandy. And Franny?
Yes, thank you very much. I've been listening keenly. I'm going to make my closing remarks using an example, a real example, and that's the case of cassava. So I was in Harare, and we were able to have very delicious cassava dishes in one of the top restaurants in Harare. And the question was, how did this come about? Because they don't grow cassava in Zimbabwe. And it turned out that there were three things that were happening that can be now scaled up for other products. First, there was very deep research into cassava varieties that was done in Nigeria that allowed cassava yields to go up, and that created trade between Nigeria and Cameroon first, and then it jumped across to other countries. Second, how did that come from Nigeria to Zimbabwe? There was a free movement of people, a lot of West Africans who came to establish themselves in restaurants and other activities in Zimbabwe. And that allowed the transference of technology. And in this case, I'm talking about Crises as the technology that was transferred. And that allowed the product to shift quite wide to another geography. But then the third thing, and this is the most remarkable one, is that that also then went out from Africa and into the United States via New York, because a chef went to start cooking these very delicious cassava-based dishes. And it turned out that because the gluten intolerance around the world is growing, there was more demand for cassava for making all sorts of things, biscuits, bread, and other dishes. So I think this is a microcosm of what Africa can do at scale. Innovate around research, particularly on varieties that can sustain different climate transformations and risks out there. Number two, using the local knowledge, cultural knowledge for the menus that are so rich across Africa and get them populated and dispersed around the continent and beyond. But then third, to organize the logistic supply chain that allows that kind of trade to take place, which is a free movement of people first, free movement of goods and the cargo side in particular, and of course the financing solutions that allow all of this to happen. So I'll leave you with that example of cassava because I think it gives a lot of opportunities for us to do more as we pick one product after the other, with protein being the next one on the horizon. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your closing remarks. And that really sums up perfectly the summit's, the tenets of this conversation. I'd like to thank all of my panelists for your contribution and your insights. And I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for keenly being here and engaged with us. So let's give a round of applause to our panelists, please, as they exit. Mr. Khalid Bomba, Managing Director of Agri-Food Transformation Agency Support Center. Mr. Ibrahima Sheikh Jong, UNASG and Director General at the Africa Risk Capacity Group, Dr. Achaleke, Senior Partner, McKinsey & Co., Dr. Eleni Gabre Madhin, Chief Innovation Officer at UNEC, and His Excellency Lionel Sinzu, Board Member, Danone, and former Prime Minister of Benin. Let's give them a round of applause, and thank you very much to all of you.